go ahead and get started. I know a few more people will probably hop on in, but want to make sure that we have plenty of time to have today's conversation and for some Q&A at the end. So thank you all for taking time out of your day to join us and be here. We know that you have a lot going on, and we appreciate that you've taken time to spend an hour with us during your lunch break or first thing in the morning or whatever time it is for you and where you are. My name is Becky Migas, she, her pronouns, and I am the founder and chief care connector for Women in Sustainability. Women in Sustainability is an inclusive social and environmental justice nonprofit that is dedicated to caring for the people that care for the planet through community, advocacy, resources, and education to create a sustainable and equitable future through the feminist viewpoint and leadership. Women in Sustainability strives to create a safe space for like-minded and diverse individuals to create purposeful connections and conversations. All are welcome in our community. Before we start, I also want to note that we're very aware that this is a sensitive topic. Women in Sustainability provides an open space for the critical and civil exchange of ideas. Some of the content discussed today may disturb some attendees, and I encourage you to prepare yourself emotionally. If you find the discussion traumatizing, please do not feel you need to participate in the conversation, and you're welcome to exit the webinar. If at any time you feel you need to talk to someone or need resources, please do not hesitate to reach out to me directly at becky@womeninsustainability.org. We ask everyone here today helps us to create an atmosphere of mutual respect, safety, and sensitivity. We greatly appreciate your support in this. So why are we here today having this conversation? Well, first, October is Domestic Violence Awareness Month, and I thought this was a great time to hold this conversation. I recently had the opportunity to meet Anne at an event where she was honored with the Building Hope Award and the keynote speaker. This speech happened to come on the same day that we learned that the Supreme Court overturned Roe v. Wade. I sat listening to Anne's speech as she spoke my language of interconnectedness. That evening, I realized that if we, especially as women leading this movement, want to help solve climate issues, we also have to be talking about intimate partner violence. After my follow-up conversation with Anne and reading her book, Every 90 Seconds, Our Common Cause, Ending Violence Against Women, I knew that this was a topic that needed to be discussed within our community. I hope that you will take away some valuable information as I have in my short time knowing Anne. In her book, she notes, individually, we have had strong motivation to avert our gaze because the threat to our own sense of self can be overwhelming. However, together, we have an interest in ending violence against women, and the path we forged together promises a better world for all of us. So please help me give a nice, warm welcome to Dr. Anne DePrince to join us in today's conversation.
Thank you, Becky, and thank you everyone for letting me spend a bit of today with you. I'm very excited.
Thank you for being here. We're so thrilled that you can join us and for being a part of this conversation. I know we talked a little bit before on how important the topic is, and we're so glad you can share your expertise. And I'd love us just to start the conversation by having you talk a little bit about your backgrounds, your work that you have had in trauma over the years, and a little bit about intimate partner violence that led you to lead to your book that you wrote.
Sure, thanks. Well, I am a clinical psychologist by training, and I've been here in Denver and at the University of Denver in particular for 20 years now. I started out my career, really my interests in trauma and violence go back to my undergraduate days where I was got involved in student activism around campus sexual assault and intimate partner violence and abuse, and then took a academic route towards trying to address those issues through graduate school. I started out studying trauma quite broadly, and oftentimes it was interesting and reflecting for today's conversation. Oftentimes in some of my early research, I would talk about interpersonal traumas versus non-interpersonal traumas. And one of the things that my advisor, psychologist Jennifer Fried, and I were often talking about was what's the role of betrayal in causing harm in trauma. And we often see that interpersonal traumas are high in betrayal, that somebody we should have been able to count on did harmed us in some way. And I think that one of the things we started to learn over time that really has been top of mind ahead of this conversation is when we look at other things that researchers have thought of as non-interpersonal traumas, you might think about extreme weather or climate-related disasters, that those still have a human component to them. And that division of what is a harm that is caused by one human being or not caused by human beings, I think has gotten a lot more difficult to sort of differentiate. But nevertheless, in my journey here, I ended up at the University of Denver, where I really focus on trauma and abuse across the lifespan. The work that Becky highlighted in Every 90 Seconds is, of course, focused on violence against women in particular. But violence and abuse don't know any particular bounds. So violence and abuse can happen in childhood, it can happen on into older adulthood, it can happen across a range of identities. This book just happens to be focused on the particular issue of violence against women. And so I also play a role at DU as Associate Vice Provost of Public Good Strategy. And in that capacity, I've gotten to work more closely over the last bit of time with our Center for Sustainability. So just another place in my own professional journey that the issues that I study in my day job as a psychologist connect more and more with the topics that I know are top of mind and passion here for this group.
Yeah, thank you so much. And I think we see a lot of that harm in today's society. We are watching Ian, who just wreaked havoc in Florida, and what's happening there, and people having to migrate and change their homes and what they're doing. I know we've talked a lot about, in your book, you talk about migration and immigration, and that is more for people coming from out of country, but we're also seeing that a lot in our own country of how we're having to migrate and how that is taking effect. And, a lot of your work is on the interconnectedness of all of these pieces, thinking about immigration and intimate partner violence and climate change and everything that goes with it. And would just love to you to talk a little bit about how you see the connection of trauma and intimate partner violence with the environmental movement.
Absolutely. I think more and more it's obvious that in both areas, whether we're trying to address trauma and intimate violence or issues related to the environment, at their core, these are issues that are about justice. In the environmental movement, we have increasingly recognized that the individuals who are doing the most harm to the planet are not the people bearing the most direct cost when we see things like the impact of extreme weather and some of the most pressing climate change crises that we're seeing these days. So these are justice. These are issues of justice, and gender violence, violence against women, it too is an issue of justice. You can, in more simple terms, see concrete connections between the issues. So Becky, you alluded to migration. When people are forced to migrate for extreme weather, we know that that's a period of time when girls and women are at particularly high risk of being victimized. Being victimized can also be something that forces people to migrate. And so you start to appreciate the layers of trauma upon trauma. Being forced to flee one's home in the context of a natural disaster is a potentially traumatic stressor in and of itself. And then the risk of victimization on that path differs by gender. So these things interact in that way. I think they interact in more subtle ways too, or they connect in more subtle ways. I spent some time in the book, but I've spent a lot of time in my career thinking about how one of the primary harms of trauma is to leave people feeling alienated. And then when we literally look at the structure of many of our communities, and how many communities, particularly those that have been historically redlined, or communities where living in poverty, you see fewer green spaces. We see fewer spaces that are good for the environment and good for building community. And both are essential for building a connection to the natural world and a connection to one another. That in my work, I very much see alienation as one of the harms of trauma. And so one of the solutions, one of the paths to healing has to be through connection. So I'll stop there, Becky, to let you get a word in edgewise, because I think, like you, I see so many connections, and you can take it at kind of a 30,000 foot level or down in the weeds, but the connections are really there.
They really are there. And you had mentioned the first time we spoke, something really powerful to me. And I would love for you to share that with everybody, if you kind of remember what that was about Mother Earth and how we treat her.
Yeah, we got to talking about Mother Earth, and I think sharing a somewhere between the surprise and not surprise to see people's not rallying to do more in the face of such clear harm to Mother Earth. And I had mentioned to Becky that I wish I saw the world differently, but in a sense, that's not so much of a surprise when you look at gender-based violence that we have for millennia been aware and okay as a society with the abuse of girls and women. So the idea that we would protect Mother Earth out of some duty to mother, some duty to the maternal or to the feminine, doesn't stand up quite as well when you compare it to what we are willing to do to girls and women.
Yeah, and I found that to be so powerful, and I share that with a lot of people about we just, how we think of women and how we think of women for years. And I'm going to encourage a lot of people to read the book, because you actually talk a lot about the history of how we even got to where we are today and how we see women and victimize women. And I thought that was really powerful too, to understand that history. And we'll talk a little bit about the book at the end. And I know, currently we have a lot of people in women's sustainability who are in businesses or run their own businesses. And, we talk a lot about CSR programs and our corporate social responsibility programs. And a lot of times it's, well, we just go and volunteer. We plant trees, we donate money, we have a day off to do social activities or social volunteer work. And I think we started to see about that CSR programs, especially in COVID, kind of fell apart. And I know you have referenced the CSR programs in the book, and would love to talk a little bit about why is it important that we need to really incorporate intimate partner violence and ways that we can see it in others, and what we can do to support as part of our programs who are working towards either CSR or ESG, environmental social governance styles, for the more broad term that we use. But yeah, I would love to know a little bit of your thoughts on that.
Yeah. Well, I think one of the things that really has stood out to me over the years of talking to different audiences and trying to get different constituents of people to see intimate violence as an issue, a pressing issue for them, is that we tend to have some stereotypes in our mind that violence against women and girls, oh, that's about post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD, or depression. It's a mental health issue. And if you sort of follow some of those threads, often the way we talk about it is it's an issue for the victim or the survivor who was abused, or it's a women's issue. It's a special interest issue. And I think what has been so remarkable for me to see across my career is that I'm hard pressed to see any area of our lives, including our economic lives, that aren't impacted by violence against women and girls. And so workplaces have a really particular interest in this issue. I think they have an interest in multiple ways. In one way, they have an interest because to the degree their workers are affected by violence against women, It can affect their ability to recruit and retain those workers, for those workers to thrive in that work context. If abusers are stalking them at work or disrupting their ability to do work, or forcing them to be late or use sick time so that an employee gets fired or something along those lines, everybody's lost out then. Definitely the woman who didn't have the opportunity to take her career to its fullest potential and thrive in that world, but the business itself. And so you see some scholars beginning to make the argument that we've expected government or families, or at different points in history, the sort of responsibility for who's going to contend with violence has fallen in different places. None of those have solved the problem. And so we have to think differently about how it's all of our issue. And so from a CSR, ESG sort of through any of those frames, I think it's important for workplaces to think about the potential that they have to develop workplace policies that are about the thriving of employees. That if part of what we're after in the environmental movement is flourishing and thriving for the beings living on this planet, then we need to think about that in terms of policies and procedures that also take into account how to be survivor-centered and trauma-informed when violence happens in the workplace or happens to employees connected to the workplace. Others have argued that violence against women takes a toll on our economies, state level, nationally, globally. So if you are a business owner, you have an interest in getting to gender parity. That will create more wealth and money. One of the paths through which we have to do that is addressing violence against women. So there are any number of ways that I think business owners and leaders can start to see a way in that is something different and more holistic, and about thinking about policies and interconnected systems, policies like paid leave and living wage. Those are violence prevention policies. They're also policies that are essential to responding when violence does happen. So I again could keep going, but do want to just say it's any number of lenses. It's so much more than simply the case that a workplace wants to look responsive by marching in a march for against violence. Do that too. It's great to show up. It's great to show we have numbers, and that is not enough. As a business, your interest is so much greater in responding effectively and working to end this issue than a walk alone will do.
Yeah, I think that's important. And you keep keep talking, because again, you're speaking the right language. And I think we talk so much about, equal pay and equal rights in the workplace, but that doesn't become part of that conversation either, at least that I've heard of in any of the conversations that I've been in. And again, that's that interconnected piece of it really is about a social issue at the end of the day. And, for women in sustainability, we say a lot of times you can't talk environmental justice without talking social justice. The two are just super intertwined. But what does that really look like? And I know that you focus also a lot on the conversation around BIPOC and ensuring the marginalized communities as well, and being a part of that, and how we can bring policy in that is not just policy on intimate partner violence, but on racial issues and on gender issues, and all of it comes together. All those isms that we talk about, I feel like kind of really comes together in that one piece. So I appreciate that viewpoint, because that was something that was really eye-opening for me. And I'm curious to know how can we spot, as people who are leaders in this movement, and the conversation isn't really well spoken or spoken about, how can we help to spot issues with people in our community who may be experiencing intimate partner violence, and ensure that we can provide the right support as we are working to intertwine environmental and social justice?
Yeah, I love that action-oriented question for how do we do our own business differently to be ready to notice and to respond. I think one piece is around making the conversation is normalizing the conversation. We've seen so much change, right? The Me Too movement brought us even further forward in breaking down taboos. And yet, the Me Too frame really still is around disclosing once violence has happened. So how can you be thinking as leaders and business owners about the conversation for everybody? What are you able to build into your calendars monthly, yearly, et cetera, to make this just an expected part of the conversation, just like we would expect to talk about other issues at work. So I think there's important work to happen that isn't so much about spotting. Certainly we want to be ready to be responsive if somebody discloses, because the research that's available suggests that women do tend to disclose when they are experiencing violence directly, tend to disclose at work. And so being prepared is great, but there's front end work first for making sure as organizations and as leaders that we're assuming in every room this is a topic that we all have an interest in raising in some way, shape, or form. I think when it comes to things, especially folks on your teams who are in leadership roles or managing teams, things that you might consider are just the ways that you check in on your team, noticing if somebody's flying through their sick time or their vacation time, or somebody who was very reliable is very frazzled and maybe not able to arrive at things on time, things that are out of character. Those could be red flags for any number of things. Those aren't necessarily red flags for intimate violence, but they are signs that we know our coworkers, we know when patterns change, and we check in with each other. And that's important for any number of issues. There's then also thinking at the organizational level or the policy level of your organizations about things like paid leave. Could somebody, if they had to go to court, could they take time off of work? Could they use paid leave to do that and not have to disclose to a boss where they're going if maybe they don't want to disclose? Do people have the ability and flexibility to be able to afford to go to a doctor's appointment, to see a therapist if they're contending with violence? So there's a whole policy level I think organizations can be thinking about to be ready to respond as well. And then certainly when we think more individually, how might I respond if somebody discloses? There's a lot of work for each of us to do there in order to be ready to know what services are available in our communities. And we have many communities around the world represented on this call. So everybody's got some homework to do if you don't already know. Does your community have a sexual assault and prevention agency? Is there a place to refer people for a helpline or a hotline around where they can get some advice on things like safety planning? Is there a place you can refer people for legal advocacy where they might be interested in things like protection orders, different legal tools that they may want to use in trying to escape or respond to violence? And that takes homework on the front end. So just like you would know in your own practice, if somebody raises compost questions, I'm going to refer here. And if they're interested in learning more about this, I've got a network, I'm going to refer there. This too is part of the substance of your work. And so figuring out those referral pipelines in order to be able to connect people. In my experience interviewing survivors, when they disclose, they're disclosing for a reason. Often it's to get some sort of help. They need help of some kind. And so it's our job, I think, as allies, as friends, as bosses, as coworkers, to try to understand what people are looking for and be helpful in opening doors. To open doors, we need to really listen to people and not hear what we expect they might need. Like, oh, they'll probably need to know about this great therapist I saw. they may or may not want a therapy referral. So there's responding individually to a disclosure is a lot about listening, about setting your own preconceived notions aside, and then based on really authentic listening, figuring out what can you offer, how can you help, and then supporting folks to make their own decisions. Violence took control away from people, so we need, whether we're operating at an individual or an organizational level, to really be focused on how do we provide information to folks so that they can make informed decisions and their own decisions about how they want to move forward in the aftermath of trauma or wherever they are in their healing. And one of the things my team studies is how the kinds of reactions people get when they disclose violence. And lots of people have the best of intentions, and yet they can quickly jump to deciding what may be best, or questioning, well, did it really happen that way? Or saying things that, again, with the best of intentions, they may not realize can sound judgmental. So it's, if somebody offers you the gift of trusting you enough for a disclosure, then I think it's our responsibility to listen very carefully and be ready to respond to what we learn from that authentic listening. So there are things to be thinking about all these levels for us as individual coworkers, bosses, managers, but then more policy and organizational level too.
Yeah, I love that. And I just love the idea of normalizing, right? Like we just need to normalize. We talk so much about that with just even climate change and talking about it on the news. And you referenced Me Too. And I think Me Too allowed us to have a more normal conversation, but yet we still have so much work to do from there. And the same thing with the climate and just making it part of our daily conversation, watching the news, and they talk about it as part of connecting the dots, that interconnectedness of this is happening. Ian was one of the worst hurricanes we've seen because of the warming climate. I think the question I have next is, how do we come to that place of normalization, or people who aren't in this space every day, who aren't around potentially people they're aware of who have been involved in any type of violence? How can we help to normalize that? And how can we help to create that confidence in ourselves so we don't have those reactions to others when they come to us with that information?
Yeah. Well, I think one of the most powerful initial ways forward is to figure out what your self-interest in this issue is. And I use that in the community organizing sense of the term. Like, why do you have an interest in this issue? And that will give you a new way to practice talking about these issues. So if I was to try to jump in and talk about this through some other lens that isn't my primary passion or an area that I feel confident in, then I'm going to sort of potentially make it much harder to just say authentic things and be in the flow of a conversation with a person. But I think if each of us can figure out what's your self-interest. I'm learning about for example, I'm learning about intimate violence, and I'm really getting passionate about it because I see how more extreme weather is going to put more girls and women at risk for sexual assault and violence during migration. Who should we be talking to? How can we, and somebody else in your social network finds that curious, is interested, and suddenly you get to have a conversation that's about the topic. You've normalized it in the sense of now we're talking about it, but you haven't demanded people talk about it through a lens that they don't have expertise in or passion about. And so I think that's part of how we just practice talking about it so that it doesn't feel quite so scary. And I will point out that there's a lot of ways one can write a book, and one can write a book, just emphasizing all the things you know and how you always knew them. That is not the book I wrote. What I tried to model in Every 90 Seconds is that I've spent 20 years trying to learn about this issue and its connection points. And I've had to learn a lot of difficult lessons, and I've assumed goofy things. And I have tried not to do harm. And when you do harm, you have to acknowledge it. But I mention that because I think sometimes we hold ourselves to a standard of I have to become an expert before I can take action. And much the same as it is the case with climate, we don't have time for everybody to be an expert. We have the fierce urgency of now. We need people to figure out where they can begin the process of change work with us. And I think it's the same for violence against women. We don't have the time for everybody to become an expert in this. We need people to be committed to ethical action and to not causing harm and being accountable if and when they do. But that's not the same as acting only once you're sure you've got it all figured out.
Yeah, thank you. There's a lot of really good information in that piece. And I will say that after reading Anne's book, I myself have also had more confidence in it. And for me, I just pique the interest. I'm not the expert. And I say that a lot with women in sustainability. And I have this really great opportunity to be a part of this organization and lead this organization. But I meet incredible community members who are the experts. And I just refer people to those people at that point. I say, oh, well, I've read this book, or I know this person, you should go watch what they're doing. But piquing the interest and getting people to engage and get them to just have that little thought in their head, I think is really valuable. I was telling Anne when we started that I've been going out and talking to people about this conversation with the environmental side, saying, oh, we have to talk about intimate partner violence and trauma as part of climate issues. And I always get the why question. And then I start to explain it and people are like, oh, yeah, okay, yeah, it's interconnected. You're right. We need to talk about it. So finding that comfort, I think, and finding that interest. And then as you engage more in the conversation, it becomes a little more easy every time to make it normal. So thank you for sharing that. You also talk a little bit about how people can show up in spaces. And I'd love to, if you'd have a minute to kind of expand on that a little bit in your book about showing up as you feel comfortable.
Yeah, I think the book and my work at the University of Denver over the last several years has given me the opportunity, I'm a psychologist, but has given me the opportunity to learn from colleagues who study social movements and larger social change and big system change, where, I was trained more as a clinical psychologist, how you think about the world as sort of one person at a time, and people are embedded in systems, but this opportunity to learn more about social movements and social change is something I'm just so grateful for. In that process of learning more about social change, Becky, if I'm honest, I got myself distracted and I lost the main thread of your question. Will you repeat it?
Yeah, so you mentioned something of how people can show up in a space to help with social change.
Yes, showing up. And so I think I was starting with the reconfessing that I'm a psychologist because I had some faulty assumptions about social change and what it takes, and that you have to be the person who's going to lead the March on Washington with a bullhorn or tie yourself to something. I don't know what my impression was. And I think what I have learned by reading community organizers, like a terrific book by Daniel Hunter called Organizing for the New Jim Crow, is that we really all have to figure out not only our passions, but the ways that we want to engage in work, and that there's room for each of us. We do need at times big actions, and we need people to lead those and be willing to march with bullhorn, and that and civil disobedience and other things may have a role to play. We also need people who are willing to do the relationship by relationship work, the organizing work, the identifying leaders in communities and supporting their development. We need folks who can play an advocacy role, and on and on. Hunter's got some great ways of talking about different roles that people can play in social movements. And so that has become an important part of what I've tried to raise with people, is whatever your stereotypes are about this issue or about how we have to show up to do work towards social change, to let go of some of that and explore. This issue connects to you, I have no doubt at all, based on the kinds of things people are interested in. There's a link there. And then there's the way that you're effective doing work, the ways of doing work that sort of make your own soul sing. And there's a place for that too. I think the one other thing I'd mention though in that section in the book on how we show up is we also have to show up in a way that we're really aware of our intersectional identities. And so are we showing up in places where we're not part of a community primarily affected by the issue? And how do we navigate, depending on our identities, when we support from behind, when we take leadership roles? I know often a lens for me is trying to think through as a white person in what spaces am I taking up a lot of space, and where do I need to be taking up less space? Where are there organizations and efforts and organizing already underway, being led by communities being affected, being led by Black, Brown, Indigenous communities? That it's on each of us to, again, do that homework, not just for referring people to resources and help, but for understanding change initiatives already underway, so that we are really building something that's more than the sum of our parts, and not building up new iterations of resources or approaches that exist. So there's room for each of us, but we have to each show up with our ethics centered around how we show up and thinking about our intersecting identities, our intersectional identities.
I think show up thinking about that, not trying to recreate the wheel, right? Like, and showing up there as yourself, I think, is important for burnout, because we're all working so hard to really change a whole system. And if you are trying to be the rebel and you really are more of the helper, then you get exhausted and you're worn out, and then we can't fight the fight. And part of really of I think social advocacy is how are we also taking care of ourselves through a lot of this mentally and physically, so that we can continue to do the work that we need to do and show up when we need to show up. So Chris has a question. I'm going to pause for a second. If anybody else has questions, please go ahead and pop those into the chat. I'm going to go over to Chris's question, but would love to get some of your questions as well for Anne while we have her here and her expertise. But Chris starts off with, Dr. DePrince, I loved your point about awareness and action in workplaces. What tips or ideas might you have for employers who want to incorporate those ideas or policies in terms of promoting understanding and buy-in? It strikes me that when we talk about the subject of intimate partner violence not being normalized yet, that can be especially true in the workplace, where sometimes people only know or think about one as another as colleagues.
Yeah, great question, Chris. And great points. There's a terrific book out called by my colleague Catherine Manning called The Empathetic Workplace. It's a little bit, it's oriented, it's great for anybody in a workplace, especially oriented towards how do you make a case for a manager, supervisor to understand the importance of being trauma-informed in workplaces. And so I'd offer that as another resource. I think though, for the so-called buy-in question, again, it's engaging with the questions of, for your company, how can you illustrate potential ways that violence against women has an impact on your workplace? And if you can show your workplace how that might be, that, for example, gosh, we moved to entirely remote during COVID and we're not planning to move back to in-person activities. We're going to stay remote. Have we done a survey of employees or done anything to try to understand What the consequences of that might be for people who have any number of issues in their home lives. It could be children who are too young to go to school that make working at home difficult. It could be abuse happening in the home. Now you have to think through very carefully how you ask such questions, who has access to such information. So I'm not saying go do a survey today of your employees, but you can start to help people understand, especially if they've thought about something like childcare responsibilities at home may make it difficult to be effective in a remote environment. Now you have an opening to introduce, well, goodness, also intimate violence, family violence could be another issue that makes it difficult at home. How have we thought about that? I think then as you think about different policies, paid leave is such a great example where I think there can be an immediate sort of reaction that paid leave costs employers. And yet some of the studies, including some done by my colleagues here at DU for the state of Colorado, show that everybody wins when there's paid leave, that it's good for businesses, it's good for the business owners and the bottom line, and it's good for employees. And now if you don't have good paid leave policies at your workplace, now you have another reason to go to people and to bosses and so forth and talk about why this is one more reason we really need to think about paid leave. It's violence prevention, it's violence response, on top of that we want our employees who are thriving. So those are a couple ideas. I think you want to, Chris, you raised the point that we may only think about our colleagues as colleagues. So you do want to be cautious not coming at this as if you're saying everyone in your workplace is potentially a victim or a survivor, because we don't want to create dynamics where people feel like they have to disclose. I think it's more showing an organization that regardless, you have a shared interest here. It may be that the employee you didn't hire because they saw that your workplace didn't have paid leave or didn't have the kind of supports they were going to need, and as they're in the midst of a divorce and leaving a relationship, you may have lost out on talent because you didn't have the right policies in place that show that you are an empathetic workplace, that you are trauma informed, that you understand these issues. So yes, sometimes it is about the individuals we're working with, but I think it's also about helping organizations understand who they're missing because of these potentially structural kinds of issues too.
Yeah, I think that that's so important to think about the new workforce that's coming in. The younger generation is demanding a lot more of their workplace than the demands have ever been before. And people are looking for those paid leaves for maternal leave, for not just for mothers, but also for fathers. I think that that's an important part of what our future is that the demand is coming from the younger generations, and starting to think about that now is going to be really important for our future. And I will also note that Good Business Colorado, if anybody is not familiar, please look up Good Business Colorado. They work a lot on these policies for businesses, including paid leave for families. So you can check them out if you're interested in engaging in that. We always encourage people to engage in policy and advocacy. I will note we have an election November 8th. For those who know that's coming up, really paying attention to your elections is really important. Who are you voting for? What is their voting record? What do they stand for? Because that really affects everything from the bottom up and the top down. So making sure that you're engaging in that process and getting out to vote this November. The midterms this year is going to be really important for all of those that live in the United States. And I had a question about that was sent to me about resources. If we will list resources, we are working on that list. We do have a resources page on our website, so we'll work to get that listed as soon as we can. And if you have any that you definitely recommend, I know Rose Andom Center here in Colorado is a great resource, but if you have any you'd like to share with us, we'd be happy to list those on our website for people.
Will do.
So Olivia asked the question, do you have any recommendations for local DV organizations on how they can do further outreach to migrant communities?
Yeah. I think I would certainly encourage talking with other organizations, and I don't want to pretend that's the particular challenge I'm that my work addresses in the community. That said, I think that what we hear from survivors is that the more seamless and the more places that they can hear about your organization and your work, the better. So what often happens in the aftermath of a trauma, particularly say something like domestic violence that gets reported to law enforcement, is that law enforcement typically gives people referrals, and there's sort of an immediate outpouring of potentially outreach from relevant agencies, or here's a list of referrals, or here's what to know about your victim, your rights as a victim, because victims have rights as crime victims. And that sometimes that isn't quite the right timing, that victims are learning, victims and survivors are learning about all of these systems and their options as they're contending with immediate post-trauma, sometimes cognitive and emotional overwhelm, other challenges, like maybe they've lost their home in the course of whatever happened, and so they're contending with houselessness and so forth. And so the more ways that we can show up at other times in people's lives, whether it's being part of other community connected events like this one, thinking about your tabling differently for in-person events, so that there are always organizations addressing intimate violence who are at events on sustainability, so that people see this sort of, I've been thinking a lot about how do we have a community that's really a wraparound for, there's no wrong door for seeing that an agency is there to help, a group cares about this issue, a group is willing to speak out about it. So I think there are some things, Olivia, that your organization probably is already doing incredibly well. And then how do we further outreach, I think, to migrant communities in particular, is to make sure that we're showing up in other spaces, that we're doing that in a culturally responsive way. That for many, we found in talking with survivors that there are often language and other cultural barriers that can make it difficult to feel like you and your culture and the particular interpretation needs you might have, that it's not easy to see that you will be cared for sometimes at different points of where folks are connecting with the victim-centered sort of world. So it's such a terrific question, Olivia. One of the things that I mentioned recently I had an opportunity to talk with a group of reporters who were at a workshop thinking about how to cover trauma, among other things. And they were talking about the burnout issue, Becky, that you raised, because they are right there witnessing traumas as they unfold and photographing them and so forth. And I was saying, like, check in on each other. And they were, there was one person who was sharing a healthy skepticism that a phone call or a text doesn't work. And I mentioned to this person that one of the projects we did several years ago basically randomized women to get outreach from community-based organizations providing services for domestic violence, or to get referrals to those organizations. And the groups didn't end up differing in how many women ended up connecting to organizations, but the women who got the outreach, there were all these gains a year later. They had fewer PTSD symptoms, less fear. They were more likely to have left their abusive partner. They found the services they got to more helpful. And it all started with a phone call. And they didn't even necessarily pick up the phone. When we asked women, did somebody call you and did you answer? Lots of women said, someone called, I never answered. But it was the fact that I knew they were there if I needed them. There's something that shifted about that sort of alienation, feeling isolated. And so I would mention that sometimes outreach has to be is a very intentional, big, community-wide effort. it is also showing up in small and consistent ways. We hear time and again from survivors, like, if you say you're going to call us, call us. If you know, that there's just these smaller ways that we emphasize our values and our commitment to individuals and to communities. So thank you for that question.
Yeah, thank you for that answer as well. I think a lot of the notes you touched on is togetherness and collaboration. And I know that that's part of what you really talk about a lot in your book, and how we move forward in this space. And there's no last questions. I have our last question, and usually I ask if you look into your magic ball, but for you, I'm going to ask, imagine sitting on your blue bench. And if you read the book, you'll understand that reference. Imagine sitting on your blue bench. What do you see as the future for the connectedness of intimate violence, intimate partner violence, sustainability, and just our future altogether?
Yeah. Sitting on that blue bench and looking into the future, I believe a different path is possible. I have studied for more than 20 years. I've been here studying it for 20 years, but for more than 20 years, I have studied the underbelly of what one human being can do to another, what groups of human beings do to one another. You have done that in your career, studying what we have done to the planet and to human and other beings on this planet with us. And yet, I radically believe that a different future is possible. And I think it is precisely through these kinds of conversations, if they lead to action. It is through coming to understand how I share a stake in the things you are most passionate about. I absolutely do. And I'm not as passionate as you all about these issues. Like here I am being passionate over here about this issue. And I'm certain that you share an interest in my passions, and that together we bring different tool sets, different opportunities, different communities and networks in, and a different future is possible. One where we are addressing the most pressing problems of our time. We're addressing intimate violence, we're addressing climate change and regenerative futures. I absolutely believe that's possible from my little blue bench. And I have come to learn to embrace radical hope, where we acknowledge absolutely the mess we are in. And through acknowledging that, we can begin to imagine the future we want and move towards it. And I truly believe that's possible.
Yeah, I love that ending on that message of hope. That is so fantastic. We also believe in hope and creating that change. This topic really touched well for me, because our mission is all about care, community advocacy, resources, education. And I think this conversation today really hit on all four of those pillars that we focus on with women's sustainability. So thank you for being here, sharing your expertise. Anne is also offering for her book, let me grab the link, I'll post it in the chat, but 30% off through the publisher's website. So for anybody that would like to read the book that we were discussing today, please open up that flyer and take a minute to purchase that for 30% off. I highly recommend it. You will learn a lot. You'll learn a lot about Anne. You'll learn a lot about this interconnectedness, and just that ending on that hope of togetherness and collaboration. So thank you so much for being here. As a thank you, Women in Sustainability will be planting 5 trees in your name through our partnership with One Tree Planted. You'll receive a certificate with that as well. And I hope that everyone connects with you one way or another through your book. We'll be sending a follow-up with a recording as well as information. Thank you. Everybody, please help me in saying thank you to Dr. Anne DePrince for being here today. We're so thankful.
Thank you, Becky. Thank you for hosting such a wonderful conversation. Thank you all. Cheers right back.
Yeah, thank you, everybody. Thank you for joining us today. Please have a wonderful afternoon. Stay safe. If you need anything, please reach out. We are here for you at all times.